give her presentation today on forced sterilization on women of color. We will be recording this session to give the opportunity for others who are not able to join us to be able to listen to the recording. And so we are going to turn it over to Marisol and have her introduce herself. But once again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. So Marisol, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Marisol Mirabal. I'm currently a junior at Lehigh and I'm double majoring in sociology and Latin American and Latino studies. And I'm serving as an OMA ambassador. And today I'll be presenting on, we're having a discussion on forced sterilization on women of color. And I'll actually be having a guest performer here with me who is Yami Jaquez. She's also a junior and she's double majoring in journalism and communication with a political science minor. So let me just start sharing my screen. Okay, can you all see this? Okay, perfect. Okay, so first I really wanted to talk about the recent hysterectomies performed on women in ICE custody. And on September 14th, 2020, a licensed nurse revealed that a Georgia detention center had been performing mass hysterectomies on women in ICE custody. Dawn Wooten, a whistleblower, discusses that people who reported having bad menstrual cycles or some serious pain had their uteruses removed. Specifically, this occurred in the Irwin County Detention Center, which had an out-of-facility doctor who became the uterus collector and even managed to remove the wrong ovary from a patient. And I was motivated to bring this discussion because there seems to be a lack of understanding and not enough awareness on forced sterilization and reproductive justice. So when this incident occurred, I thought it was a really good time to learn more about it and bring this up for more people to learn more about it. But I just wanted to ask if anyone had any thoughts when this occurred that they wanted to share with everyone.
Hey, Marisol. So I guess I'm a little shocked that this is still happening today in 2020, 2021. This is a practice that goes all the way back to slavery and forced sterilization and removal of uteruses of women of color and Black women in particular. And so to say that this is still a practice 400 years later is actually quite shocking. I had not heard of Dawn Wooten, but yeah, this is rather mind blowing, to be frank.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Just to clarify for anyone that doesn't know, a whistleblower is a person who informs on another person or organization engaged in an illicit activity. Okay, so then I also wanted to show you all this statement from the representative Pramila Jayapal, and I'm gonna read it out to you, but it's basically talking about what ended up happening to the women who were forcibly sterilized in the Irwin County Detention Center. So she says, late yesterday, I was briefed by 3 attorneys representing women who were detained at the Irwin County Detention Center in Oxala, Georgia, and subjected to forced invasive procedures by gynecologists connected with the private for-profit detention center. It has become painfully clear to me that the initial reports brought to light on Monday by whistleblower Dawn Wooten and Project South are likely part of a pattern of conduct. Since the initial story broke, I understand that there are at least 5 independent attorneys representing women who have found themselves to be part of this horrific pattern, subjected to unnecessary forced sterilization or medical procedures over the last several years. It appears that there may be at minimum 17 to 18 women who were subjected to unnecessary medical gynecological procedures from just this one doctor, often without appropriate consent or knowledge, and with the clear intention of sterilization. Because the majority of immigrants are pro se or unrepresented, it is also possible that there are additional similar cases for individuals who have already been deported or did not have legal representation. So I wanted to bring this into the discussion because clearly it's not a one-off instance. It did not occur to just one or two people, and there are at least proof of 17 to 18 women that have undergone this sterilization just this past semester, so a few months ago. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what is forced sterilization. Sterilization is defined as a process or act that renders an individual incapable of sexual reproduction. Forced sterilization occurs when a person is sterilized after expressly refusing the procedure without their knowledge or is not given an opportunity to provide consent. So I'm just wondering, how does this definition align with what you previously thought? If anyone has anything to share, please feel free to. Did many of you know what sterilization was, or forced sterilization?
Mhm. Yeah, I can chime in here, Marisol. So I'm familiar with the term, and I think one of the first, aside from hearing, that this was occurring, historically during slavery, but also just with stories of how it occurred in Puerto Rico, and the different types of testing that have been going on. And which caused sterilization. But this forced sterilization piece is another mechanism of oppressive behavior that again takes away the agency of humans, right? Not just it's hurting not just women, obviously, directly hurting women, but it's also hurting the family structure and taking away from some cultural values that are also very much implicated when this type of behavior, this type of forced sterilization occurs.
Yeah, thank you, Clara. You bring up some really great points, and I'll also be mentioning a little bit more about the sterilization that occurred with Puerto Rican women later on, and that is also a lot about what Yami wrote about for her poem that she will be sharing with us later. So next on, I do have a short video to show you all about the racist roots of forced sterilization. Just give me a second to get this up. Okay, can you all see this?
Birth control is amazing, but only if it's what you want. Low-income women of color are more likely to be pressured by doctors to use contraception than white women, even if it's not their preference. But this is nothing new. In the early 20th century, birth control gave women a newfound freedom over their bodies. But the reproductive rights movement was quickly co-opted by eugenicists, who believed they could improve the country by lowering the birth rate of the so-called unfit. In other words, sterilizing poor women, women of color, and those with disabilities. Even Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, used eugenics to justify birth control. She thought society would be better if so-called unfit people had less babies, even if her intentions were good. Eventually, 32 states adopted mandatory sterilization laws. In the 1930s and 40s, North Carolina sterilized about 8,000 developmentally disabled people without their consent. Roughly 5,000 of them were Black. By the 1970s, 70,000 people had been forcibly sterilized across the US. including 1/3 of women of childbearing age in Puerto Rico and nearly 1/4 of Native American women, which caused some smaller tribes to face near extinction. In 1978, the government moved to limit the use of federal funds for sterilization, but coercive practices have continued. In the early 1990s, judges in several states gave women convicted of child abuse or drug use during pregnancy a choice: use Norplant, a contraceptive inserted in the arm, or go to jail. And from 2006 to 2010, nearly 150 women were sterilized in 2 California state prisons, 1/4 of them against their will. Even today, doctors are still more likely to tell low-income women of color to have fewer kids than middle-class white women. At what point will the fight for reproductive rights be inclusive of all women?
Okay, so what were some things that you found interesting or surprising that you didn't know before or that you learned throughout this video?
I suppose the prevalence that it's occurring at, even in 2021. I had heard about it happening at ICE facilities in the last few years, but I guess I just assumed it was an isolated incident, and it seems like that's not the case.
I think also like eugenics playing a part in the Native American community as well, something that is not really like talked about. So that's important to learn about that and continue expanding on that too.
I didn't know it was actually happening here in the United States. And I'm just curious, like how they, like what does the doctor say to the woman? Like how they, I don't know. How do you get the female to follow through with it? That's what I'm curious about. And like, how comes nothing's getting done?
Yeah, those are really good questions.
If they're in ICE facilities, I'm wondering if they're not even having bilingual doctors. So they're not even attempting to get informed consent.
I was about to say, we can't forget the forced part of this.
Right.
Which is that this is happening to women without their consent. And
Right.
times without their knowledge.
And so why do you think low-income women of color are being targeted?
So obviously they are targeting women who society in general aren't focusing on, don't care about, and women who don't have the resources to take some kind of legal recourse. Yeah.
I think this
I was just going to say the way that they describe it as being for the undesirable, right? Like who is deeming them undesirable? Is it their status, their cultural background? Like why are we coming up with this undesirable term to then place it sort of like an excuse for this awful practice?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think we have eugenics and things to thank for that. And I think it also really plays into the discussion before about like if this is happening in ICE facilities or like, for example, with the Puerto Rican women, there's that language barrier. So they all like obviously don't understand what's happening to them. And so the doctors are probably like coercing them into this. Okay, so why and how did this become legalized across the United States? As it was mentioned in the video, there were laws that were adopted into 32 states.
I mean, how does anything become legalized across the country? A lot of it from the time frame is the patriarchy. Why and how in this day and age do we have a political party fighting the rights of voters to vote on a Sunday in the South? You know, none of it makes any sense. You look at it, you go, well, wait a minute, why are we suppressing votes? You know, why are we targeting low-income women of color on any subject? It's so hard to explain the why of it. You just think things should be so different now than they were in the 50s or 60s, and they really aren't. They're not.
You know, it's funny that we're having this conversation. I had an assignment doing, and I'm going back to Foucault, and I've literally been reading a lot of his work for the last year. And, you know, it comes down to that fundamental thing in terms of power dynamics in human relationships. So you will ultimately have those who have power and those who don't. And those who have power will use that power to essentially do whatever they want to their benefit. So and then those people with power also have the ability to determine what is knowledge, what is fit, what is desirable, what is acceptable. And then they continue to leverage that power to make that the quote unquote norm. And so people begin to even replicate that and perpetuate that norm, even, you know, whether intentionally or unintentionally, not even recognizing how much a part of that systemic problem they are. And so, you know, it's coming to conversations like this and continuing to read and so on, and becoming more critically aware of these things that will allow us or help us to kind of unseat some of those, you know, power dynamics and those practices of domination that, you know, continue.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything you said. It's definitely about the power and like the patriarchy. And I also wanted to ask, like, what are other ways that we've seen these coercive practices taking place?
I don't know if this pertains to what you're asking, but I'm reminded of a number of photographs that have been on social media recently of lawmakers in a room debating things like access to abortion or birth control, and they're all white men making decisions about women's bodies.
They're all white men with a lot of money and access to a lot of money. And I think that's a critical factor here, you know, especially as we're looking at people from lower SCS. They don't have the money to fight these people.
It also strikes me that there might be fear from the patriarchy, because if they felt their hold over society was so strong, they might not need to do all these different things that have been mentioned, like voter suppression, the forced sterilization, the killing of people of color by the police. So it's maybe a fear that if the poor are so numerous, would gain power, then they could unseat the power structure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, yeah, that was very good. And so how does eugenics impact the modern day reproductive justice movement?
I think racism is alive and well. I mean, that's, you know, we're all here trying to educate ourselves so that we can fight it. But the fact is that we are the minority in terms of the fight, I believe.
It could also be a toehold because there's a sexist element to it too. So it provides a precedence for control over reproductive rights over all women.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that eugenics also helps to shape these public health policies, and it influences like physicians and politicians to, as like exactly what you were saying, to think that women's bodies are a site for political contestation and for political control, which definitely like really plays into it.
And even currently, when you think about just maternal and fetal health care statistics in the US, women of color are 2 to 3 times more likely to die during that period than their white female counterparts. So it still continues.
I was about to mention that, Kadya, and also bring up, as I understand, there's a movement for home births in the BIPOC community because of that.
Yeah. So to go into it a little bit further, what is reproductive justice? So reproductive justice is defined as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable ways, and sustainable communities. And I believe we talked about this a little bit, but how does this definition sort of align with what you already previously thought, or how does it differ?
It makes me think a little bit more broadly about how eugenics and racism play a role. Like I'm even thinking about just restriction of resources for low income women of color, and like those who are already parents, and those who might want to be parents. Yeah, just like resources in terms of health, and also money and benefits and things like that, and how many kids end up getting put into the foster care system. I think all of that also kind of ties into this.
Yeah, 100%. So I wanted to also show a short video on the history of reproductive justice. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second.
Reproductive justice. A lot of people talk about it, but many don't know what it really means. Here's the basic idea. Coined by 12 Black women in June of 1994, the term is the combination of 2 phrases, reproductive rights and social justice. The new phrase reflected the lives and experiences of Black women in the United States who had been denied a full range of services and protections. Black women have multiple identities, like age, ability, sexual orientation, immigration status, religion, and nationality, just to name a few. Consider the fact that Black women experience some of the highest rates of poverty and only make 63 cents for every dollar a white man makes. Nearly 20% of Black women have no health insurance and die 4 times as often as white women from pregnancy-related causes, regardless of income or educational status. The issue at play here is intersectionality, a term coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, which refers to how multiple systems of oppression work together. Reproductive justice is how we take on all the systems that harm us. Reproductive justice is the human right that can only be achieved when all women and girls have the complete economic, social, and political power and resources to make healthy decisions about our bodies, our families, and our communities in all areas of our lives. Reproductive justice centers the leadership and lived experiences of the most vulnerable, including but not limited to Black women, women of color, LGBTQ people, and youth. So there you have it. Reproductive justice has given thousands of women a framework to change policy, improve services, collaborate with other social justice movements towards our collective liberation. For more information, contact In Our Own Voice at www.blackrj.org. Thanks for watching and welcome to the movement.
Does anyone have any initial reactions to this video that they'd like to share?
So basically they took women's freedoms away. and their freedom, of choice, and a choice that they can never make again. They took a piece of them, away.
I think my reaction was that it made me angry. And you asked the question earlier why low income and women of color, and again, it relates to intersectionality. We're talking about women, we're talking about the people who are paid the less, who have less access to resources, and lower mortality rates. And so this intersectionality is real. Like it is materialized in their bodies.
And Chad, I think you took us to a very important question. So how is intersectionality important with reproductive justice?
So I became interested in this issue when I started working with data sets on the African American mothers and their babies who fare so much worse compared to other women of other race and ethnic backgrounds. And it just kind of goes on to confirm how we will never reverse trend unless we do something about this kind of endemic systemic issues. So I just don't think I will be able to do my job properly. I mean, without the bigger issue being addressed, these historically vicious cycles of racism that affect human health in such a profound ways. I wish I could share my data with you.
I think it's super important for us to not to really look at it as an intersectional approach that needs to happen here, because it is systemic. It is policies and practices that are affecting women, and so we can't look at it as a singular challenge here that comes, just with gender, but all of the other isms that were mentioned in the video. And really understanding how intersectionality plays a key part in understanding how to find solutions for this issue.
Thank you all for that. Yeah. And so another question that I wanted to talk about is Black women are usually at the forefront of social justice movements, yet most of the time their hard work goes unnoticed. If you listen closely to the video, they mentioned that the term reproductive justice was actually coined in 1994 by Black women. And so I wanted to know, why do you think that is that Black women's hard work tends to go unrecognized? Especially if this is an intersectional issue.
Well, that seems to be another device of suppression and control and asserting power over someone. I guess to me, it's been surprising or revealing to think about how the uterus is so symbolic of the creative life, the creative force of women, promoting life, bringing forth life, sustaining health and life, and like the life cycle of human beings from birth to death. And so to take that away from someone is really to take away a central aspect of who they are. Perhaps I'm just speaking from my own point of view.
So one thing that comes to my mind, when Serena Williams had her baby maybe 4 or 5 years ago, she had some complications related to childbirth, and it took her a lot of persuasion to convince her doctors that something was wrong. And here's someone, okay, she's a woman of color, but she also has a lot of influence and obviously a lot of money. And fortunately, she and her child are perfectly healthy, but it was a struggle. And it's possible that she was actually at risk of having severe medical complications. So, she's someone who has a good bit of influence, and you think of so many women who don't have her recognition level or socioeconomic status, and they just don't have the same voice.
I definitely agree, and I feel like that's definitely why reproductive justice is so important today. But would anyone have anything else to share for why reproductive justice is important today?
I could say something. I don't know if you can hear me, Maricel. It's Marilisa Jimenez talking. I'm in my car. I was like, I need to hear this. But the thing is, it's kind of going back to the question before too, like, why don't we remember that reproductive justice was, coined by Black women, and even intersectionality, I would also say, is a term people forget is coming from Kimberly Crenshaw, right? And like another Black woman. We forget to cite women of color. We forget to give them credit for the work that they've done, even in trying to show the injustice and trying to create solutions. A lot of times narratives are co-opted, and the way that women are excluded from their own sort of like knowledge systems. But I think it's important today because we still have systemic racism and literally state violence, genocide, right? That is happening. We can still see this, and we can see how it's been a product and a project over time. So we can't forget the history, but we also can't say that it's not possible for something like, sterilization, mandatory sterilization and things like that to happen again. So that's what I would say. And great work doing this.
Thank you.
I want to jump in on Marlisa's point because Marlisa, I think you're very generous.
I could be a little meaner though if you want.
Because I don't think it's that we forget to cite. I think it's intentional.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think folks are not forgetting because they know how, and they cite other folks' work. They do it all the time. And so I think what is happening is an intention to erase Black women and women of color from the record at the end of the day. And I think that's very intentional. And I think part of that is because historically there's been no accountability on that. So you can do it and you can get away with it, and nothing will happen to you or happen in your career. And so I also think it's because folks are not serious about solution building. For a lot of folks, we engage in this work maybe to advance our individual careers, whether they be in research or administration or whatever it is, but we're not really serious about finding solutions and enhancing solutions, because if we were, then we would be centering the voices, the lives, the perspectives and experiences of Black women and women of color.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that you said, Chad. And I wanted to go a little bit further into talking about some of the examples that we've seen of the eugenics program and sterilization in the United States. So I'm just going to read these off. For the eugenics program, eugenics laws were passed in 32 states in the early 20th century and led to the sterilization of approximately 60,000 people. California's eugenics law, passed in 1909, allowed anyone in a California institution to be sterilized. In California, Latinx people were disproportionately targeted. Latinx women were sterilized at 59% higher rate than non-Latinas, and Latinx men were sterilized 29% than non-Latinx men. In states like North Carolina, Black women were sterilized at 3 times the rate of white women and 12 times the rate of white men. And then to talk a little bit more about the Puerto Rican woman. Law 116, imposed on Puerto Rico by the United States in 1937, legalized sterilization in Puerto Rico because they believed it was too overpopulated to maintain a stable economy and to lower unemployment rate. The procedure was able to be done on men and women, but mainly women were the ones sterilized. They used coercion tactics so women would be sterilized and did not tell them that their sterilization was a permanent form of birth control. And they also lied about the reversibility of the procedure. And in 1955, they also began to experiment hormonal birth control on poor Puerto Rican women who were never informed about the clinical trials that they were undergoing. And this is not the first time that there have been experiments on people of color in the United States.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
For the Puerto Rican women, is that the testing of the Dalcon shield? I'm not sure if you're aware of that. Dalcon, it was like, no?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay, sorry. I was just wondering if like, there was something with like a Dalcon shield, which is where it was pretty much meant as not for sterilization, but more so as birth control. And so they brought it to Puerto Rico and tested it in PR, and it had a lot of negative effects. And so I was wondering if this was the same incident.
Yeah, I mean, that is reminding me of then the experimentation on birth control for Puerto Rican women. So that could possibly be one of the drugs that resulted from the studies.
Thank you.
I could clarify a little bit there if you want, because it was a couple kinds of you know, birth control devices and pills. A lot of the pills were really different kinds of birth control pills, but there certainly were some procedures and certain kinds of like birth controls or birth control devices that sort of like inserted in the body that were also experimented on. And unfortunately, I did have some family members that were impacted by this. So it's one of those things where it's like that secret that nobody wants to talk about also in families. But there is actually a great documentary you could watch about that. That is called La Operación, and it's about sort of like the testimonies of those women.
Thank you for bringing that up. I was also going to mention the movie La Operación, and there's also another one called No Más Bebés as well. I think those are really informative. And then to also talk about Native American women, after the Family Planning Services and Population Research Act of 1970, 25% of Native American women were sterilized. And we believe this number to be higher, but there's no exact way to get the information. And the Hyde Amendment, also passed in the 70s, prevented all low-income women from terminating a pregnancy, and disproportionately affects women of color, and Native American women were specifically discriminated against. And so after hearing about some of these examples, what are your initial thoughts, or do you know of any other examples that you wish to share that occurred in the United States?
I guess I would connect this back to your other questions about why Black women, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Latinx women are not at the forefront, particularly around reproductive justice. And I think part of that is because I don't think in this country when we talk about reproductive justice, we are still stuck in reproductive rights, which is a conversation that it has been privileged by white women and privileging white women's bodies. And if we can't allow justice to take over, which I think should be the focus that we have, then we're going to continue that intentional erasure that Chad was talking about, that Marilisa talking about, of Black women who are leading this conversation and should be leading the conversation. Thinking about intersectionality as the goal. I don't think reproductive rights is about intersectionality. I think it's about white women's bodies and the continuation of the white race. That's my sort of cynical read.
Yeah, you're definitely right. And I was doing research for this. I was trying to see if I can pull some like books or other movies that I could find. and a lot of them were on like reproductive rights. And it was kind of disappointing to see that there wasn't really much being done on reproductive justice and the movement currently going on. And there was also not as much information on forced sterilization. Any other thoughts?
Well, while I was doing research as well, there were sterilization happening in prisons, not just one prison, different prisons in California towards Black women and women of color. And this was recent. This wasn't like years ago. This was actually like 5 to 6 years ago. I don't have the exact article, but I could try to find that and put it in the chat. But I just thought it was just like crazy that like this is like happening actually to like women in prison. So yeah.
Yeah, I believe that was from 2006 to 2010. That was a great example. Thanks, Tammy. Okay, so to talk a little bit more about this, I believe it was Dr. Jimenez who mentioned this as a form of genocide. So is forced sterilization a modern form of genocide? Does anyone have any thoughts they wish to share on why they think it is genocide or why they don't think it's genocide?
I can say why I decide to call it genocide, but it's specifically because it's state sanctioned, right? It's not just like you just happen to be walking down the street and all of a sudden, you know, it's state sanctioned violence against women of color and against their right to choose, decide. I mean, just so many different ways, right? And then also the impediment of furthering the family line, the generation. So that is genocide. Anytime the state is involved, especially.
I'm wondering, is it possible that by calling it genocide, it's sanctioning the notion that, you know, before birth, that there's life before birth, which is an argument that's used against the rights for women to have abortions?
I mean, I think it is at its most basic, you know, geno means race, and it's a killing of a race. And so if we're targeting BIPOC women and men, as mentioned, then yeah, this is an attempt to kill certain races, to destroy them and to destroy their future children. So yeah, I do think it fits.
And I mentioned the difficulty in trying to find resources to talk about reproductive justice and forced sterilization. And I also feel like it's not talked about enough in our daily conversations. So why do you think that is? Why is it not talked about enough? Especially if it is considered genocide.
I would go with the emotional route. Like it must be trauma. Like it's a traumatic experience. You know what I mean? Like when I think of this, like anger, I think of like deep depression. Like this is not something that people have like signed up for. This is something like the state has done to them. You know what I mean? So that's where I would go about it. I wouldn't want to talk about it necessarily if it would bring back such traumatic memories.
Sort of building off of that, I think that, you know, it's an ugly part of history. And I think that ugly parts of history tend to be swept under the rug because people don't want to confront it necessarily.
Also, it seems to target vulnerable population, you know, people who are in detention, people who live in reservations, people who may not know their rights and agency and choices. So educating educating these vulnerable populations seems urgent to me.
I agree with that. I also think that, in not talking about it, we keep the masses ignorant. I had no idea this is going on, in the past 5-10 years in the United States. So if I'm ignorant of it, I'm not going to do anything about it. So I think that's part of it is continuing the ignorance.
I can't help but to think that one of the reasons it's not talked about in mass is because people really don't care. I don't know how many examples, both contemporarily and historically, we need to understand that people in general and in mass in this country don't give a damn about BIPOC lives and BIPOC women lives and specifically.
Well, I mean, there needs to be maybe more of a public outcry and the different groups joining together to demand better treatment. It's so inhumane. It's a shame for the country to allow this to occur. Like something needs to be done.
I definitely agree with what everyone has been saying. I feel like people are starting to care at least a little bit more than before, but there's still nothing really being done about it. Like there was a big public outcry in September with what happened at the ICE detention centers, but have we heard anything else about that now? No, we haven't. So there's a lot more work to be done. And so in saying that, what are some things that you think you have learned or will be taking away from this discussion?
I mean, just on a super basic level, like talk about it. Because I think what we saw from, a bunch of attendees here today is like a lot of people still don't know that it's happening like right now. And I think that raising at least that basic level of awareness is a way to start. Obviously, it will take a lot more than that, but it's a step in the right direction, I think.
I think on top of that, it's also important for us to really look at more research that needs to be done in this area to back up not only what has happened, but also to bring to light some of these the data behind this issue. It seems that, from what you mentioned, Marisol, you were looking for more information and more research on not just reproductive justice, but this forced sterilization. So how do we expand on that research? As those of us that are in academics, how can we continue that conversation, not just with our peers and colleagues outside of academia, but also in enriching that research to really move some of those solutions forward?
I think one of the other things that really it shouldn't shock me, but it does. But someone mentioned earlier about the all-white male committee discussing reproductive rights, which happens, we see that happen all the time. But what shocks me is the stupidity of some of those men, how little they know about female reproduction and reproductive systems and how things work. I remember one congressman in particular, I can't think of his name, but he was of the belief that you won't get pregnant when you're raped because your body knows to reject that. It knows so it's not possible. And you go, these people are leading our country and they have no idea how things work. The basic anatomy or basic science, they have no idea. And I'm shocked every time I see it. I probably shouldn't be by now, but it just, how do you legislate something that you do not understand? And why will you not educate yourself to better legislate?
Well, I think if we had a power structure that reflected the diversity in our culture, then that would be better, because how can we educate all these white men to understand all the different perspectives? We just need the power structure not to be full of only white men.
I think they're playing a game. It's not even what they believe in. It's just they're saying whatever is going to get them voted in. They're very when they speak, they're hollow. There's no meaning behind it. They're not real.
And so, Laura, to your point, for folks to be able to say this in public spaces at this time as a way to get votes, right? So not to say this and then folks vote against them, but people are saying these things publicly and people are signing up and lining up to vote them into office. That to me is the crazy part.
But a lot of people want to vote, but there's just so much effort at voter suppression. I mean, it's really hard to work against that.
And so this is why at the end of the day, the problem is both intersectional and the solution has to be intersectional. Because as Mary Cell has done an excellent job at today, this is reproductive justice, this is social justice, this is voting rights justice, this is racism, this is sexism, this is class. Like the solution has to also be intersectional.
Also, I have a lot of young women of color friends who are not documented, and there's kind of the urgency, and I mean, they have issues that they face render that to view these reproductive issues as a luxury, as something that could put off until later years. So protecting them, I mean, seems so urgent to me.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Well, thank you all for bringing that to the discussion. I have a guest performer here, Yami Jaquez. She will be performing in this laboratory.
Hello, everyone. So before I start the poem, I'll just explain why I decided to do research on this and do my project on this. This is actually a project for Dr. Jimenez's class. She was just here. She left. But yeah, so basically I read this book by Luis Morales, and the book is called Through the Eyes of Rebel Woman. And she brings up Young Lords Party. They're based in Chicago, and basically they got inspired by the Black Panther Party to do political work, help the community and bring awareness to different issues. And one of those issues was reproductive justice in Puerto Rico. And so that's where I kind of like went off and I started like doing research on what was going on in Puerto Rico from the 30s to the 50s and like on with reproductive justice, birth control trials, sterilization. And this next poem is about a particular trial that happened. So yeah, let me just find it because I got so into the presentation, I lost okay. So the poem is called In This Laboratory. I'm in a dark laboratory, misinformed about the experiment. And now these scientists made a settlement testing my reproductive experience. I'm living in this world as a lab rat, forced to take these pills that change my hormones. All these changes just create a cyclone. My head spins in a circle, it's a war zone. Although I signed up for this, I didn't understand their agenda. They are exploiting the poor in one gender, mixing the wrong ingredients in one blender. They test for their answers. I'm a small variable to their equation, always being used, like in this occasion. My body colonized a new invasion. Thank you. So yeah, this was about the trial in Rio de Piedra, and these many different trials were made. But this particular one was made by these two white men, Gregory Gregory Pincus and John Rock. And what they did is they went, they had these birth control pills. Obviously they were experimenting on them, so who knows what the birth control pills had. And they went door to door and they were basically telling the woman like, okay, well, this is going to be an alternative, like if you don't want to have kids no more. But that's it. They didn't really tell them that they were going to be monitored throughout months on how these pills were going to like affect their body. And so, and it's also important to mention that these pills that they brought to the island were not FDA approved at all. So very like ethically wrong in the first place. But so yeah, they got these women to sign up. They didn't even know that they were being monitored. They didn't even know what they were putting in their body. They just knew that, well, the pill was supposed to like not give them babies. And so they ran with their research back to the United States to put that research to birth control pills for white women to make it, make the pill better for white women. So yeah, that's what inspired me to write this poem.
Thanks, Yami, for bringing that into this space. I think it was really important and necessary for understanding.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to both Maricel and Yamalin. That was an incredible poem. Someone mentioned in the chat if you were able to share that poem with us, that would be fantastic, and we could actually post it on our website if that's okay with you. Both of you have brought up so many important points that need to be continued to be explored, and so we invite you as an audience to really take a look at not only the resources that Maricel has put together and what to do next, but also continue this conversation outside of this space. As we've mentioned so many times in this conversation today, this needs to be, a light needs to be shone on it, and we need to really ensure that folks are putting this as a priority to talk about and find solutions. And as Chad has mentioned, and others as well, giving credit to those women who are doing this important work and this important research as well. We are coming up to time, so I just wanted to once again thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Maricel and Yamalin for the amazing presentation and poem, and also want to share with you that we have some amazing topics coming up for the month of April, some of which include a frank talk on the history of intersectional anti-Asian violence and resistance, debunking immigration myths, and continuing conversation about how to have difficult conversations with your family. We have some other topics as well, so please make sure that you keep up with our newsletter and join us as always at this space on Thursdays at noon. Thank you all once again, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.